He looked at her like she was a stranger in her own home, like every breath she took was evidence of something she had not done. And in that moment, sitting across a dinner table that had once held laughter and routine, she realized something had quietly changed in the man she married 12 years ago. Not all at once, not in a single argument or a single betrayal, but in the small pauses, the extra questions, the way he now watched her cook as if waiting for something to go wrong. She said later she still remembers the silence that night more than anything else, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to press against your chest. He stared at the plate in front of him and said nothing for a long time, just studying it like it held an answer he was afraid to speak aloud. When he finally looked up, his voice was low, almost calm, but there was something unsteady underneath it. He said, "You expect me to eat this?" And she laughed softly at first, thinking it was another one of his strange moods lately, but the laughter didn't last because his expression didn't change. That was the moment everything started to feel wrong in a way she couldn't explain. That night did not begin with shouting or chaos. It began with routine. A simple dinner in a quiet suburban home where nothing on the surface suggested that anything life-altering was about to happen. But sometimes the most ordinary moments are the ones that carry the most weight afterward, because they are the last memory of normal before everything breaks apart. She had cooked the meal the same way she always did, carefully, methodically, thinking about nothing more than finishing another long day. But he had been different for weeks, watching more closely, asking questions that didn't need answers, quietly pulling away from the comfort they used to share. He had started believing something he could not prove, something he could not let go of. And when belief becomes stronger than reason, even the simplest dinner can begin to feel like a threat. That evening, he barely touched his chair before he started questioning her again, asking where she bought the ingredients, how long the food had been sitting out, why the smell seemed different this time. She tried to reassure him, tried to keep her tone steady, but she could feel the distance between them widening with every word he spoke. And then he said it again, more firmly this time, that he was not sure he could trust what was in front of him. Those words hung in the air longer than anything else in the room, because trust is not something that disappears loudly. It fades quietly, and sometimes you don't notice until it is already gone. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But what makes this case disturbing is not just what happened, but what he believed was happening. Because in his mind that night, he was not sitting at a dinner table with his wife. He was sitting across from someone he had started to fear, someone he had convinced himself was no longer safe. And when a person begins to see danger where there is none, even love starts to look like something else entirely. He stared at the plate again, then at her, then back at the food, as if trying to decide which truth he was supposed to accept. And in that silence, before a single bite was taken, before anyone understood what this night would become, something irreversible had already begun. He sat there longer than she could understand, not eating, not speaking, just staring at the plate like it was a question he was trying to solve in his head. The kind of silence that filled the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, the kind that makes even normal sounds feel too loud. She remembers asking him softly if everything was okay, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing just a little, like he was studying her instead of the meal. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was controlled in a way that made it worse. He said he had been thinking about things, noticing things, and that sometimes people don't realize what they're capable of until it's too late. She asked him what he meant, but he didn't explain. He just looked at the food again and said he wasn't hungry anymore. But what she didn't know was that in his mind, this wasn't just dinner. It had become a test, something he believed he had to survive. Over the past few weeks, small doubts had grown into certainty for him, even though nothing around him actually confirmed it. He started remembering every time he felt unwell after eating her cooking, every time he felt tired or uneasy, and instead of questioning himself, he started questioning her. That night, those thoughts were no longer quiet. They were loud enough to change the way he looked at the person he had lived beside for over a decade. She stood up slowly, trying to keep things normal, trying to move past whatever mood had taken hold of him. She went back into the kitchen for a moment, thinking maybe giving him space would help. Maybe things would settle like they usually did after tension. But when she returned, she noticed something had shifted. His attention wasn't just on her anymore. It was on everything around him. The kitchen, the counters, the placement of the plates, even the way she was standing. It was as if he was building a case in his mind without saying a single word out loud. In that moment, she still believed it was just another argument, another strange phase he would eventually come out of. She didn't realize she was already inside something that was no longer about misunderstandings. It has become something rooted in fear, and fear doesn't need proof to feel real. It only needs belief. And once belief takes over, even the simplest actions can start to look like evidence. He finally pushed his chair back slightly, the sound scraping against the floor, and that small movement alone changed the atmosphere again. She turned toward him, expecting him to say something else, maybe to explain what was going on in his head, but instead he just looked at the two plates on the table. That's when the silence between them stopped being just uncomfortable. It started feeling final, like something was approaching a point of no return without either of them realizing it yet. He didn't move for a while, just kept looking at the table like he was waiting for it to give him an answer. The house behind them was quiet in the way homes are when nothing is happening on the surface, but inside that quiet there was a tension building that neither of them had the language to describe. She noticed his breathing had changed slightly, slower at times, then sharper, like he was trying to steady himself against thoughts she could not see. When she asked him again if he was all right, his response came slower than before. He said he didn't know anymore, and that sentence alone carried more weight than anything else he had said that night. Because it wasn't an accusation, it wasn't anger, it was confusion turning into something heavier, something that was starting to reshape how he saw everything in front of him. What she didn't realize was that in his mind, he had already started separating reality into pieces he could no longer connect properly. The woman sitting across from him was still his wife in name, still the person he had shared years of his life with. But in his perception that night, she was also becoming something uncertain, something he could not fully trust. And once that kind of thinking begins, even the smallest details start to feel significant. The way she moved around the kitchen earlier, the way she placed the plates, the timing of her return to the table, everything started forming patterns that only existed in his interpretation. She tried again to bring things back to normal. She spoke softly, asked him to just eat, to talk to her, to stop thinking so much into things that weren't there. But the more she tried to ground him, the more distant he became. It wasn't that he wasn't hearing her, it was that her words no longer landed where they used to. Something in him had shifted from listening to evaluating, from trust to suspicion, and that shift changes how even love is processed. Then came the moment that would later be described as the turning point of everything that followed. He looked at her directly and said he felt like something wasn't right. Not that she had done anything specific in that moment, but that something about the situation itself felt off. And the way he said it made it clear he wasn't asking for reassurance anymore. He was looking for confirmation of what he already believed. That was when she realized this wasn't a misunderstanding she could fix with words. It was something he was already convinced of, something she hadn't been told about until it was already shaping his decisions. She stood there for a second longer than she should have, trying to understand how a normal evening had shifted into something she no longer recognized. The table between them suddenly felt wider, not because of distance, but because of what was happening inside his mind. And in that widening space, something small and unnoticed began to take shape, a decision forming quietly, one that neither of them could yet see the consequences of. He finally pushed his chair back again, this time a little farther, and the sound it made against the floor seemed louder than it should have been in a house that quiet. She watched him closely now, not because she expected anything specific, but because she no longer felt sure what he might do next. His eyes kept moving between her and the plate, then briefly toward the kitchen, as if the answer he was searching for might be hidden somewhere behind her instead of in front of him. He asked one more question, slower than before, almost careful, asking if she had eaten the same thing he was being offered. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it made it feel like something else entirely. She nodded, confused, saying she had already eaten earlier, and for a moment he didn't respond at all. That silence again filled the space between them, stretching longer than comfort allows, as if time itself had slowed down inside that room. What she didn't know at that moment was that his mind had already moved beyond the dinner table. He wasn't just reacting to what was in front of him anymore. He was reacting to everything he had been thinking about for weeks. Every doubt he had allowed to grow without interruption. Every quiet suspicion he never voiced out loud until now. And when thoughts are left alone long enough, they begin to feel like facts, even when nothing has changed in reality. He stared at the two plates again, and something subtle changed in his expression, not anger, not relief, but decision forming without words. She noticed him finally reach forward slightly, not to eat, but to adjust one of the plates, moving it just a little, as if trying to understand it better by changing its position. That small movement would later become one of the most important details of that night, though at the time it seemed meaningless. She asked him again what he was doing, her voice tighter now, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at her and said something she didn't expect. He said he needed to be sure. Not about her, not about the food exactly, but about what he believed was happening. And in that sentence, something shifted completely, because certainty was no longer something he had. It was something he was trying to create. She took a step closer, trying to interrupt whatever thought was building inside him, trying to bring him back into the moment they were actually in, but it felt like he was already somewhere else mentally, somewhere she could not reach. And as she reached for the table, not realizing what would come next, neither of them understood that the simplest movement in that room was about to set everything into motion in a way that could not be undone. Her hand barely touched the edge of the table when he suddenly pulled the plate a little closer to himself, not aggressively, but with a quickness that made her pause. It wasn't the action itself that unsettled her, it was the intention behind it that she couldn't read anymore. He was no longer behaving like someone simply having doubts about dinner. He was behaving like someone trying to confirm a fear he had already accepted as truth. She told him again, more firmly this time, that there was nothing wrong with the food, that he was overthinking it, that he just needed to calm down and eat like normal. But the word normal seemed to land strangely between them, as if it didn't belong in that room anymore. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in refusal to accept reassurance. And that quiet refusal changed the entire feeling of the moment, because now nothing she said could easily bring him back. What she didn't realize was that in his mind, he had already begun separating what he believed from what she was telling him. And once a person reaches that point, conversation stops being a bridge and becomes a barrier. He looked down at the plate again, then at her, then slowly toward the kitchen entrance, as if trying to reconstruct how everything had been prepared, step by step, in his mind. She watched him do this without understanding the depth of what was happening internally. To her, it was still confusion, still stress, still something that could be talked through. But to him, it had already become a matter of certainty he was trying to verify. And that difference between them would become the most important gap of that night. He finally spoke again, softer this time, saying he needed a moment alone. Not to leave, not to end the conversation, just to think. But even that request carried something heavier underneath it, because it wasn't just distance he was asking for, it was space to believe what he was already beginning to accept. She hesitated, unsure whether to stay or give him that space, and in that hesitation, the moment stretched further than it should have. The house around them remained still, but inside that stillness, something irreversible was quietly approaching without either of them fully recognizing it yet. He finally stood up from the table, slowly, like the weight of his thoughts had made even simple movement difficult. She watched him carefully now, not because she was afraid in that moment, but because she no longer understood what direction the night was heading. He didn't speak at first. He just turned slightly toward the kitchen again, then back to the table, as if trying to piece together a moment only he could see clearly. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, and he said he couldn't do this. She asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that changed everything. He said he was going to prove what was really in front of him, not accusing her openly, not shouting, but stating it like a conclusion he had already reached internally. And that was the moment the conversation stopped being a disagreement and became something else entirely. She tried to reach for him emotionally, asking him to sit down, asking him to stop and think about what he was saying, but he was already moving in a different direction mentally. He walked past her toward the kitchen counter where the plates had been prepared earlier. And as he stood there, looking down at them again, he began reconstructing every step in his mind, every detail he thought mattered, Every moment he believed could explain the fear he had been carrying for weeks. She followed him, her voice calmer now, trying to ground him again, but it felt like speaking to someone standing further away than just a few feet. He wasn't fully present anymore in the way he had been earlier that night. What neither of them realized was that the mistake that would define everything had already happened before this moment, quietly, without intention, in the simple act of moving around a shared meal. Two plates that were never meant to be questioned had become the center of a belief he could not separate from reality anymore. And in that belief, he made a decision. He picked up one of the plates and said he would eat it himself, not because he was hungry, but because he needed to know once and for all what was happening. She immediately told him not to, that it didn't make sense, that he was letting fear control him, but he had already lifted the fork. He took a bite. The room went quiet again in a different way. Not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet that comes after a decision has been made. He waited, watching himself, watching her, listening to his own body for something he expected to happen. Seconds passed, nothing immediate, and that silence should have been enough to bring him back to reason. But instead, it deepened his confusion, because now he no longer trusted even his own senses. He put the fork down slowly, staring at her, and said he still wasn't sure. That sentence broke something invisible between them, because it meant even reality itself was no longer enough to convince him otherwise. And that was when everything escalated in a direction neither of them controlled anymore. He stepped back from the counter suddenly, his breathing changing, his hand gripping the edge as if trying to steady himself. She rushed toward him, asking what was wrong, calling his name repeatedly, but his focus was no longer on her. It was inward now, trapped between fear and belief, unable to separate what was real from what he had convinced himself might be real. Within moments, he collapsed to the floor, and the sound of it filled the entire house. She froze for a second before screaming his name, dropping beside him, shaking him, trying to understand what was happening. The meal, the argument, the suspicion, everything collapsed into panic at once. She called emergency services, her voice breaking, trying to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. And when paramedics arrived, the scene they walked into was already filled with confusion. A husband unresponsive on the floor, a wife insisting she had done nothing, a dinner table still untouched in its final state. At the hospital, tests began immediately. Toxicology reports, blood work, everything expected in a suspected poisoning case. But hours passed, then more hours, and something unexpected started to emerge. There was no poison, no chemical substance, no external toxin in the food, nothing that explained the fear that had driven the entire situation. And slowly, the focus shifted away from what was eaten and toward what was believed. Doctors began to suggest something else entirely. Severe anxiety, psychological distress, a stress response so extreme that the body reacted as if it were under physical attack. What had happened that night was not the result of poison in the food, but poison in perception. A mind so consumed by suspicion that even safety could no longer register as safety. When he finally regained consciousness, the truth was explained to him carefully, slowly, without judgment. That there was no evidence anyone tried to harm him. That what he feared had not been real. And for a long time, he didn't speak. Because in that moment, the realization wasn't just about one night. It was about every thought he had allowed to grow without question leading up to it. The marriage did not survive in the way either of them once imagined. There was no dramatic courtroom ending, no criminal case, no public verdict. Just two people standing in the aftermath of something that had started silently long before that dinner. She left not because of what was in the food, but because of what had already been eaten emotionally long before that night. Trust, once broken in the mind, does not return easily, even when truth finally arrives. And he was left with something heavier than punishment. The understanding that what destroyed that night was not poison, not intention, not betrayal, but fear allowed to grow without challenge until it replaced reality itself. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a home is not what is prepared in the kitchen, but what is believed in the mind. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And the question that remains is this: when trust disappears, does truth even matter anymore? Or is the damage already complete the moment doubt takes control? He didn't say much after that night, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every explanation now felt heavier than silence. The house that once held routine conversations and shared meals started to feel different, like both of them were moving through it without truly occupying the same space anymore. She still went about her days, still cooked, still cleaned, still tried to maintain a sense of normal life. But something between them had already shifted beyond repair. He, on the other hand, began replaying that evening in fragments, not just what happened, but what he believed he felt in those moments. The doubt didn't leave him quickly. It stayed in smaller thoughts, in pauses, in the way he now looked at things he once never questioned. What makes moments like this difficult to understand is how ordinary everything looked from the outside. There was no obvious sign that a relationship was breaking apart in real time. No dramatic explosion, no visible collapse at first glance. Just two people slowly adjusting to a reality that no longer matched what they once shared. Friends noticed distance before either of them ever admitted it. Conversations became shorter. Visits became less frequent. And questions about how things were going started receiving careful answers instead of honest ones. Because once trust is damaged in a way that feels irreversible, even simple conversations begin to require effort. Over time, what happened that night became something neither of them could fully avoid thinking about, but also something neither of them could fully return to. For him, it became a moment he tried to understand again and again, searching for clarity in memory that kept shifting under emotional weight. For her, it became a reminder of how quickly certainty in a relationship can dissolve when fear takes over perception. She often thought back to the exact moment when the conversation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like something she could not reach anymore, no matter how carefully she spoke. And slowly, what remained was not just the memory of a dinner gone wrong, but the realization of how fragile trust can be when it is replaced with suspicion that has no proof behind it. Because once the mind begins to build its own version of reality, even truth can arrive too late to change the outcome. Years later, neither of them would describe that night the same way. That difference alone said everything. One would remember fear. The other would remember confusion. And somewhere between those two versions of the same evening, the truth sat quietly, no longer powerful enough to undo what had already been decided in silence. And maybe that is what makes this story linger long after it ends. Not what was eaten at that table, but what was no longer believed between two people who once trusted each other completely. After that period, life did not suddenly become dramatic or chaotic in the way people often expect from stories like this. Instead, it became quieter in a more unsettling way. The kind of quiet that comes when two people are no longer building anything together, but are still sharing the same space out of habit, history, or obligation. They spoke when necessary. They coordinated small things. But the emotional connection that once made even ordinary days feel shared had thinned out completely. He eventually started avoiding the kitchen when she was cooking, not out of accusation anymore, but out of discomfort with his own memory of that night. Even though he now understood what the doctors had explained, understanding did not erase what he felt in the moment when fear was at its peak. The mind does not easily delete experiences that felt like danger, even when later proven otherwise. And so, in quiet moments, he still found himself questioning his own judgment, not of her anymore, but of himself. She, on the other hand, began reflecting on the gradual changes she had noticed long before that night. The small shifts in behavior that she once brushed off. The subtle distance that slowly replaced closeness. And she realized something painful in hindsight, that most breakdowns do not begin with one event. They begin with ignored signals, unspoken concerns, and emotional gaps that widened silently over time. That dinner was not the beginning of the problem. It was simply the moment everything became impossible to ignore. Friends and family eventually noticed the separation more clearly than either of them announced it. There were no public explanations, no dramatic statements. Just absence where presence used to be. And for people watching from the outside, it was difficult to understand how something so ordinary on the surface could end in such emotional distance. But for them, the answer was not found in one moment. It was found in everything that built up to it. He tried, at different points, to rebuild his confidence in his own perception, to separate fear from fact. But trust, once fractured internally, takes longer to restore than external explanations can fix. And she reached a point where she no longer wanted to exist in a version of a relationship where she was constantly being interpreted instead of trusted. That difference eventually became the final divide between them. Looking back, what stands out is not a single action, but the slow transformation of how two people began to see the same reality differently. One through fear that felt real in the moment, the other through confusion that never fully received explanation until it was too late to matter in the same way. And perhaps that is the quiet weight this story leaves behind. Not the idea of wrongdoing, not the idea of intent, but the realization that relationships are often not broken by one clear event. They are broken when understanding stops arriving at the same time for both people. Because by the time the truth becomes clear, sometimes the connection that needed it is already gone. Months passed, and eventually the routines they once shared became separate routines lived under different roofs. She moved into a smaller place across town, somewhere quieter, somewhere that didn't carry the memory of that dining room every time she walked past a kitchen table. He remained in the house for a while longer, though people close to him later said he rarely spent time in the dining area anymore. It wasn't because he feared the room itself. It was because certain memories become attached to ordinary spaces so deeply that even walking through them forces a person back into emotions they would rather avoid. For a long time, he tried convincing himself that the entire situation had simply been stress, exhaustion, pressure from work, maybe even age catching up emotionally in ways he never expected. But deep down, he knew it was more complicated than that. What unsettled him most was not the fact that he had been wrong. It was how real the fear had felt while he was experiencing it. The certainty had been so convincing in his mind that night that even now, after every explanation and every medical report, part of him still struggled to understand how his thoughts had reached that point without him stopping them sooner. She rarely spoke about him after the separation, not out of hatred, but because she had grown tired of revisiting a version of her life that no longer felt understandable even to herself. Friends would sometimes ask if she believed he ever truly thought she wanted to harm him, and she never answered immediately. Because the truth was difficult to explain in a simple way. She did not believe he was evil. She did not believe he wanted to destroy their marriage. She believed something far quieter and more painful had happened. She believed fear slowly replaced trust until he no longer recognized the difference between instinct and imagination. And that idea stayed with her longer than the marriage itself. The realization that a person can sit across from someone they once loved deeply and slowly begin interpreting ordinary actions as threats simply because doubt has been fed for too long internally. No affair had triggered it. No crime had caused it. No hidden plot existed underneath the surface. It was simply the gradual collapse of emotional certainty inside one person's mind, unfolding so slowly that neither of them understood how serious it had become until it finally exploded into that one unforgettable night. Years later, when people close to them reflected on the situation, most focused on the dramatic detail everyone remembered first: the swapped plates, the collapse, the ambulance. But those who understood the story more deeply realized the real tragedy happened long before that. It happened in silence, in weeks of suspicion left unspoken, in conversations avoided, in fears allowed to grow unchecked because they seemed too irrational to confront openly. And maybe that is why stories like this remain with people long after they end, because they force an uncomfortable question into the mind of anyone listening. How many relationships quietly change shape before anyone notices? How many people slowly stop trusting each other without ever saying it out loud? And how many moments that appear sudden were actually building quietly for years underneath ordinary life? By the end of it all, there was no villain standing in handcuffs, no courtroom revelation, no dramatic confession waiting at the finish line. Just two people separated by a fear that became stronger than communication. One left carrying guilt for thoughts he could no longer fully explain. The other left carrying the pain of being doubted by someone she once believed would always know her heart better than anyone else. And in the end, that may be the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the thing that destroys a relationship is not betrayal itself, but the belief that betrayal exists, even when it doesn't. Years after the night that changed everything, the dinner table was gone. The house had been sold. The photographs packed away. The routines they once shared existed only in memory now, scattered across places neither of them returned to emotionally. But even after all that time, one detail continued to follow both of them quietly through the rest of their lives. Not the ambulance, not the hospital, not even the collapse itself. It was the look they gave each other before any of it happened. Because somewhere between love and fear, there was a moment where trust could still have been saved. A moment where one honest conversation might have changed the direction of everything that followed. But like many relationships that slowly fall apart, neither of them understood how serious the silence had become until silence was the only thing left between them. He later admitted to someone close to him that what frightened him most was not the fear he felt that night, but how convincing that fear had become inside his own mind. The certainty. The way suspicion had slowly replaced reason without him noticing it happening in real time. And she would later say something equally heartbreaking. She said the hardest part was realizing that by the end, he no longer looked at her like someone he loved. He looked at her like someone he was trying to survive. That sentence stayed with everyone who heard it. Because in the end, there was no poison in the food, no hidden murder plot, no criminal mastermind waiting behind closed doors. Just two people sitting across from each other at a dinner table, while fear quietly consumed the one thing their marriage could not survive without: trust. And maybe that is why this story unsettles so many people, because it forces us to ask a question most of us avoid until it is too late. How do you save a relationship once doubt begins to feel more believable than love? He looked at her the way people look at strangers in dark parking lots, cautiously, carefully, as though danger might suddenly reveal itself if they stopped paying attention for even a second. And for Emily Carter, that look hurt more than the words that followed. Because 12 years earlier, when they first met, Daniel Carter used to look at her like she was the safest place in the world. But now, on an ordinary Thursday night in a quiet suburban home outside Columbus, Ohio, he stared across the dinner table at the woman he once loved and asked a question that would destroy everything they had built together. He asked her if she expected him to actually eat the food sitting in front of him. Emily laughed softly at first because she thought he was joking, but Daniel didn't smile back. He kept staring at the plate with the kind of focus that made her stomach tighten immediately. And in that moment, before the ambulance, before the hospital, before either of them understood how far things had already gone, something inside that marriage quietly cracked. That night did not begin with violence or shouting. It began the same way countless nights before it had begun. Emily came home from work exhausted, carrying grocery bags in one arm while trying to answer a voicemail from her younger sister with the other. Daniel was already home sitting in the living room with the television on low volume. Though later Emily would say she could not remember a single thing he had actually been watching. He barely looked up when she walked in. That had become normal lately. Not the silence exactly, but the distance inside it. The feeling that even when they occupied the same room, they were no longer sharing the same emotional space. Still, she moved through the evening routine the way she always did. Shoes off by the door. Groceries on the counter. Dinner preparations beginning before sunset disappeared completely outside the kitchen window. And for a while, nothing seemed unusual. But sometimes the most life-changing nights begin so normally that people fail to notice danger until it has already settled quietly into the room beside them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The first signs had started months earlier, though Emily did not recognize them for what they were at the time. Daniel had always been thoughtful, detail-oriented, the kind of man who remembered expiration dates and paid bills 3 days early. But sometime during the previous year, that attention to detail changed into something heavier. He started questioning small things repeatedly, asking whether milk smelled different, wondering if medications had been mixed incorrectly at the pharmacy, complaining that certain meals tasted unusual. At first, Emily dismissed it as stress. Daniel had recently lost a management position at a logistics company after nearly 18 years there. And although he pretended the change did not bother him publicly, privately she knew it wounded him deeply. He became quieter afterward, more withdrawn. He spent longer hours awake at night scrolling through medical forums, reading stories about hidden illnesses, contaminated products, unexplained symptoms. Emily assumed it was temporary. She believed once life stabilized again, he would return to himself. But fear rarely announces itself loudly in the beginning. It enters quietly. A thought here, a suspicion there, a question repeated too many times. And over time, those thoughts begin connecting themselves together until the person experiencing them no longer notices the line between concern and certainty. Daniel started keeping notes in a small black notebook he carried around the house. Dates, meals, physical symptoms, tiny observations nobody else would have considered meaningful. Headaches after breakfast, fatigue after dinner, dizziness on Tuesday afternoon. Emily found the notebook accidentally one weekend while searching for batteries in the kitchen drawer. She asked him about it jokingly, but Daniel immediately became defensive, grabbing it from her hands faster than she had ever seen him move over something so small. He told her she wouldn't understand, that people ignored warning signs until it was too late. Emily apologized, though privately the interaction unsettled her more than she admitted. Weeks passed, and the distance between them widened slowly enough that neither fully confronted it. Daniel became suspicious of restaurants, then grocery stores, then eventually the meals prepared inside his own home. Not every meal at first, just certain ones. Emily would notice him hesitating before eating, smelling drinks before taking sips, studying ingredient labels longer than necessary. Once, during dinner, he abruptly stopped eating halfway through and asked whether she had added something different to the sauce. Emily laughed awkwardly and told him it was the same recipe she had used for years. Daniel nodded but did not finish the meal. Later that night, she overheard him in the bathroom vomiting, though he insisted afterward that it was just acid reflux. The incidents continued, growing more frequent. What frightened Emily most was not the accusations themselves, because Daniel never fully accused her directly in those early months. It was the way he watched her, quietly, constantly, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he believed existed underneath ordinary life. Sometimes she would catch him standing silently in the kitchen doorway while she cooked. Other times she would wake in the middle of the night and find him sitting upright in bed staring into darkness as if listening for something only he could hear. When she asked what was wrong, he usually answered with the same phrase, "I'm just thinking." But eventually, she realized thinking was becoming the thing destroying him. Friends noticed changes too. Daniel stopped attending neighborhood gatherings. He avoided cookouts. At church, he seemed distracted during conversations. Emily's sister Claire later admitted she became worried months before the collapse happened. She remembered one afternoon when Daniel quietly asked her whether Emily had ever talked about being unhappy in the marriage. Claire said no immediately because, as far as she knew, Emily still loved him deeply despite the growing emotional strain between them. But Daniel kept pressing gently, asking strange questions about betrayal, resentment, whether people could hide anger for years without showing it outwardly. Claire brushed the conversation aside at the time, assuming Daniel was depressed after losing his job. None of them realized how deeply his fears had already rooted themselves inside his thinking. And then came the week everything accelerated. 3 days before the incident, Daniel experienced a severe panic episode while driving home from a hardware store. He later described feeling suddenly convinced something was wrong inside his body. His heart raced. His vision blurred. He pulled onto the side of the road believing he was dying. Paramedics evaluated him at the scene, but hospital tests revealed nothing physically dangerous. Doctors suggested anxiety and recommended follow-up psychological evaluation. Daniel refused. He told Emily afterward that the doctors missed something important, that nobody was listening carefully enough. Emily begged him to speak with a therapist, but Daniel interpreted the suggestion as dismissal rather than concern. That argument lasted hours and ended with him sleeping in the guest bedroom for the first time in their marriage. The following night was even worse. Emily prepared pasta for dinner, but Daniel barely touched it before suddenly asking if she had changed brands of seasoning. Emily snapped back in frustration that she was tired of being interrogated every time she cooked. Daniel immediately became quiet after that, but it was not the quiet of surrender. It was the quiet of retreat, the kind that signals a person is withdrawing further inward instead of returning outward toward resolution. Later that evening, Emily found him throwing leftovers into the trash outside rather than storing them in the refrigerator. When she confronted him, he denied it at first before finally admitting he no longer trusted certain foods. Emily cried that night alone in the bathroom, because for the first time she realized this was no longer simple stress. Then Thursday arrived. The day itself felt strangely ordinary. Emily worked a full shift at the dental office where she had worked for nearly 9 years. Daniel spent most of the afternoon at home. Security camera footage from a neighbor later showed him pacing in the backyard for almost 40 minutes alone. Around 6:30 that evening, Emily started preparing dinner. Grilled chicken, rice, steamed vegetables. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. A meal so simple that later investigators would struggle to understand how it became the center of such emotional devastation. Daniel entered the kitchen twice while she cooked. The first time he asked where she bought the chicken. The second time he asked whether she had washed the vegetables thoroughly. Emily answered patiently, though frustration was beginning to show through her voice. She could feel herself becoming exhausted by the constant suspicion hanging over every interaction. At one point, she stopped cooking entirely, turned toward him, and asked directly whether he genuinely believed she would hurt him. Daniel looked stunned by the question, but instead of answering immediately, he simply said he didn't know what to believe anymore. Those words stayed with Emily long after everything else faded. Dinner was served just after 7. 2 plates sat on the table beneath warm kitchen lighting while rain tapped softly against windows outside. Emily remembered noticing how quiet the room felt before anyone even sat down. Daniel stared at the meal without touching it. Emily tried making small conversation about work, about Claire calling earlier, about ordinary life continuing around them, but Daniel barely responded. Finally, he asked whether she expected him to eat the food. Emily laughed nervously again, though this time fear slipped underneath the sound. Daniel didn't laugh. He kept staring at the plate like it held something dangerous. Then came the sentence Emily would later repeat during therapy sessions for years afterward. Daniel looked directly at her and said, "If something happens to me, at least now I'll know the truth." Emily immediately pushed her chair back, asking what he meant, but Daniel ignored the question. Instead, he stood, walked toward the counter where the plates had briefly rested earlier, and stared down at them silently. What neither of them noticed in that moment was how easily ordinary movements can alter everything. During preparation, Emily had briefly switched the plates while cleaning spilled sauce from the table. She did it absent-mindedly, without significance, without memory of the act afterward until much later. But now those plates represented something far more dangerous inside Daniel's mind. He picked one up slowly. Emily begged him to stop acting this way. She told him he needed help. She told him fear was changing him. But Daniel had reached the point where reassurance no longer entered his mind as comfort. Everything now passed through suspicion first. He sat back down, lifted the fork carefully, hesitated for several seconds, then finally took a bite. Nothing happened immediately. Daniel chewed slowly while staring at Emily across the table. She stared back in disbelief and heartbreak, unable to understand how they had arrived at this moment from the life they once shared. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Daniel placed the fork down carefully but did not relax. Instead, his breathing subtly changed. His eyes moved toward the glass of water beside him, then toward the kitchen again. Emily noticed his hand trembling slightly. He suddenly stood again. This time the movement was abrupt enough to startle her. Daniel gripped the edge of the table tightly and whispered that something felt wrong. Emily rushed toward him, insisting nothing was wrong, but Daniel's breathing became faster with every passing second. Panic spread visibly across his face. He clutched his chest. His knees weakened, and within moments, he collapsed onto the hardwood floor beside the dining table. Emily screamed. The 911 call, later released publicly, lasted nearly 6 minutes. Throughout the recording, Emily cried uncontrollably while trying to explain what happened. She kept repeating that she didn't understand, that he thought something was in the food, that she didn't put anything there. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but confusion filled the scene immediately. Her husband collapsed after dinner, a wife hysterical beside him. 2 partially eaten plates are still sitting on the table. At the hospital, suspicion initially moved in the obvious direction. Toxicology testing began almost immediately. Doctors searched for signs of contamination, poisoning, allergic reaction, anything that could explain the physical collapse. Meanwhile, police quietly questioned Emily in a separate room about the marriage. Had they been fighting? Was there financial trouble? Did Daniel fear her for any reason? Emily answered every question through tears, repeating the same thing over and over. He thought I was poisoning him. But hours later, the results came back. No poison. No lethal substances. No contamination. Nothing in the food capable of causing physical collapse. Doctors then shifted attention toward Daniel's psychological state. Cardiologists found signs of extreme stress response, elevated heart rate, severe panic activation, hyperventilation intense enough to mimic medical emergency symptoms. Piece by piece, the explanation formed slowly and painfully. Daniel had become so convinced he was in danger that when he ate the meal, his body responded as though the threat were real. Fear triggered the collapse, not poison. And then investigators uncovered the final detail that shattered what remained emotionally between them. The plate Daniel ate from had originally been intended for Emily. The realization devastated him once he recovered enough to understand it fully. Everything he believed that night collapsed under the weight of one simple truth. Emily had not been trying to harm him. The meal he feared most was the exact meal she would have eaten herself. But by then, the damage extended far beyond dinner. Emily visited him in the hospital only twice. During the second visit, Daniel apologized repeatedly through tears, but Emily barely spoke. Not because she hated him, because she no longer recognized the relationship they once had. She later explained to a therapist that the hardest part was not the accusation itself. It was seeing fear replace love in his eyes. Seeing the person who once trusted her completely begin looking at her like someone dangerous. Their marriage ended quietly 6 months later. No courtroom battles, no public scandal, just paperwork, silence, and two people carrying different versions of the same memory for the rest of their lives. Daniel eventually entered therapy and was later diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder complicated by paranoid thinking patterns triggered by prolonged emotional stress and isolation. Treatment helped him understand what happened intellectually, but emotional understanding arrived slower. He admitted years later that what frightened him most was how convincing the fear had felt in the moment, how completely his own mind had rewritten reality without him noticing it happening. Emily rebuilt her life elsewhere. Friends said she became calmer after the separation, though also quieter. She rarely discussed the incident publicly because she understood something most people listening never fully grasped. Daniel was not evil. He was afraid. And fear, when left alone long enough, can distort even the safest relationships into something unrecognizable. Years later, the dining table from that house no longer existed. The home had been sold, their photographs packed into boxes neither opened often anymore. But one memory stayed with both of them permanently. The look they gave each other before he took that first bite. Because somewhere in that moment, there had still been time for trust to survive. One conversation, one honest admission of fear, one decision to seek help sooner. Any of those things might have changed everything that followed. But silence has a way of growing heavier over time. And by the time either of them fully understood what was happening, doubt had already become more believable than love. That is what makes this story stay with people long after it ends. Not the ambulance, not the hospital, not even the collapse itself. It is the realization that sometimes relationships are not destroyed by betrayal. Sometimes they are destroyed by the fear of betrayal. And once fear becomes strong enough, even an ordinary dinner table can begin to feel like a battlefield between two people who once believed they would always protect each other. Long before that Thursday night became the defining memory of their marriage, there had been smaller moments that Emily kept returning to afterward, moments that once seemed forgettable but later felt important in ways she could not ignore. One of them happened nearly 8 months before the collapse, during a family barbecue at Daniel's older brother's house. It was a warm afternoon filled with ordinary conversation, paper plates, children running through sprinklers in the backyard. Nothing dramatic happened that day on the surface. But Emily remembered watching Daniel quietly stop eating halfway through his meal after noticing a strange taste in his drink. At the time she laughed and told him he was imagining things again. Everyone else laughed too. Daniel forced a smile and brushed it off publicly. But later that night, he stayed awake for hours researching symptoms online while Emily slept beside him unaware. Looking back, she would later wonder whether that was one of the first moments he truly started distrusting his own sense of safety. The difficult part about fear growing inside someone slowly is that it rarely announces itself clearly enough for people around them to understand the seriousness early on. Most of the time, it hides behind ordinary explanations. Stress, fatigue, job pressure, aging, temporary anxiety. And because those explanations sound reasonable at first, loved ones often adjust themselves around the behavior instead of confronting it directly. Emily did exactly that. She began changing recipes whenever Daniel questioned food. She replaced cleaning products because he thought certain smells felt unusual. She stopped buying specific brands he claimed gave him headaches. Piece by piece, without realizing it, she began adapting her life around his fears instead of recognizing how much power those fears were starting to gain over both of them. Daniel himself did not fully understand what was happening internally. That was part of what made the situation so painful later. He was not consciously trying to destroy his marriage. In many ways, he believed he was trying to protect himself from danger he genuinely felt existed. The human mind has a frightening ability to turn repeated thoughts into emotional certainty over time, especially when those thoughts are fed in isolation. Daniel stopped talking openly about his worries because he noticed people reacting with concern whenever he mentioned them. So instead, the thoughts remained private. They circulated internally without interruption. And when fears remain trapped inside someone's mind long enough, they often become stronger precisely because nobody else is challenging them directly anymore. About 4 months before the incident, Emily noticed Daniel had started keeping bottled water hidden inside the garage refrigerator. At first, she assumed he simply preferred colder drinks while working outside. But one evening, she discovered something stranger. Several containers of canned soup and packaged meals stored separately from the rest of the household food. When she asked him about it, Daniel hesitated before answering, then quietly admitted he felt safer preparing certain meals himself because at least then he knew exactly what was inside them. Emily stared at him in disbelief, unable to decide whether she should feel angry or heartbroken. Daniel immediately tried explaining himself afterward, saying he knew it sounded irrational, saying he hated even admitting it out loud. But the damage of hearing those words lingered long after the conversation ended. What made the situation more complicated was that Daniel still loved Emily deeply. That truth never disappeared entirely, even during his worst moments mentally. Friends later described how confusing it was watching someone simultaneously care about a person while slowly fearing them at the same time. He still bought her flowers occasionally, still asked about her day, still apologized after arguments. But underneath those gestures lived a growing uncertainty that contaminated everything else emotionally. Emily could feel it every time he hesitated before meals, every time his eyes lingered too long on medicine bottles or ingredient labels, every time silence replaced reassurance during conversations that once felt easy between them. The isolation after losing his job intensified everything. Without daily structure, Daniel spent increasing amounts of time alone with his thoughts. He stopped exercising regularly, stopped answering calls from friends. Nights became especially difficult. Emily sometimes woke around 3 in the morning and found light glowing underneath the office door. Inside, Daniel would be sitting in front of the computer reading medical forums or watching videos about hidden toxins, food contamination, unexplained illnesses. Whenever she asked why he kept consuming material that frightened him, he always gave the same answer. Because people ignore warning signs until it's too late. Eventually, Emily began questioning herself too. Not because she believed she had done anything wrong, but because prolonged suspicion changes the emotional atmosphere around everyone involved. She became overly careful while cooking, double-checking ingredients, explaining every small step aloud without realizing why she felt compelled to do so. That may have been the most heartbreaking part of all. The fear was no longer affecting only Daniel. It had started reshaping her behavior too. And still, despite all of it, neither of them truly believed the situation would end the way it did. That is often how emotional collapse works inside long relationships. It does not feel catastrophic while it is happening slowly. People normalize things step by step. They adjust to discomfort little by little until behaviors that once seemed alarming begin feeling routine. By the time the full weight of the problem becomes impossible to ignore, months or even years may already have passed. The hospital psychiatrist who later evaluated Daniel described something important in private records released much later. He wrote that Daniel displayed a pattern common in individuals experiencing prolonged anxiety combined with obsessive fear responses. Specifically, the tendency to search constantly for confirmation of danger while unintentionally dismissing evidence of safety. In simple terms, once Daniel began believing something harmful might be happening, His mind started filtering reality through that belief automatically. Every coincidence reinforced fear. Every reassurance felt incomplete. Every physical sensation became potential evidence. And on the night of the dinner collapse, that psychological pressure finally reached its breaking point. But what continued haunting Emily afterward was not just the collapse itself. It was the realization that Daniel truly believed he was in danger while sitting across from her. Not pretending, not manipulating, not acting, believing. That understanding made moving on far more complicated emotionally, because anger is easier to process than grief mixed with sympathy. Emily once admitted during counseling that part of her still pitied him despite everything. Because somewhere underneath the paranoia and fear was still the man she married, buried beneath thoughts he no longer knew how to control. And perhaps that is what makes stories like this so unsettling. The absence of a clear villain, the absence of hatred, the realization that sometimes people can destroy the things they love most not because they want to cause harm, but because fear slowly convinces them harm is already happening. 3 weeks after the hospital incident, Daniel returned to the house for the first time alone while Emily was at work. He later claimed he only went back to collect paperwork and a few personal belongings, but neighbors noticed his car remained parked in the driveway for nearly 4 hours. Inside that quiet house, surrounded by the remains of a life that no longer felt stable, Daniel did something he would never fully explain to anyone afterward. He recreated the dinner. Investigators only learned this later through security footage from inside the home that Emily had installed months earlier after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. The footage showed Daniel standing alone in the kitchen, carefully placing 2 empty plates onto the table exactly where they had been that night. Then sitting down, then moving one plate slightly to the left, repeating the movement again and again, like someone trying desperately to locate the exact second where reality split into 2 different outcomes. Psychologists later described behavior like this as a form of retrospective control-seeking. The human mind struggles to reconstruct moments connected to emotional trauma because accepting randomness feels unbearable. Daniel could not stop thinking about how something so small, a plate absent-mindedly switched while cleaning a spill, had completely shattered his certainty. Because if the plates had not been moved, he would have continued believing his fears were justified. That realization disturbed him more deeply than the collapse itself. Emily discovered the footage accidentally weeks later while reviewing unrelated security notifications on her phone. Watching Daniel sit alone at the dining table nearly broke her emotionally in a way the original incident had not. Not because she feared him anymore, but because for the first time she fully understood how trapped he had become inside his own thoughts. He wasn't trying to prove she was guilty anymore. He was trying to understand how he had become someone capable of believing she was. But understanding did not rebuild trust. That remained the tragedy neither of them could solve. As therapy sessions continued, Daniel slowly began revealing fears he had hidden for years even before losing his job. Feelings of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, anxiety about becoming dependent on others as he aged. The job loss had intensified those insecurities until ordinary uncertainty started transforming into perceived threats. Therapists explained that when individuals lose control in one area of life, the mind sometimes attempts to regain control elsewhere, often through obsessive monitoring or suspicion. Daniel's obsession with food, safety, and hidden danger became his way of trying to manage emotional instability he never learned to confront directly. Emily listened to parts of these explanations during joint counseling sessions, but by then emotional exhaustion had already taken hold inside her. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from spending months defending yourself against accusations nobody else can see clearly, even when the accusations are indirect, even when the person making them is suffering mentally. Eventually, love alone becomes too heavy to carry without trust supporting it underneath. One evening after counseling, they sat together silently inside the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before Emily finally asked the question she had been avoiding since the hospital. "Did you really think I wanted to hurt you?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He stared through the windshield at nothing for a long time before finally saying something that stayed with Emily permanently afterward. "I thought something bad was happening. And after a while, I stopped knowing where the fear was coming from anymore." That sentence captured the entire collapse of their marriage better than anything else either of them ever said publicly. because by the end, the fear no longer needed logic to survive. It had become self-sustaining. Every anxious thought created more anxious thoughts. Every doubt demanded another explanation. Every reassurance faded too quickly to matter. And over time, Daniel's mind stopped distinguishing between emotional discomfort and actual danger. The psychiatrist overseeing his treatment later wrote something else deeply unsettling in private evaluation notes. He stated that the human brain is capable of physically reacting to believed threats with extraordinary intensity, even when those threats are objectively false. Increased heart rate, chest pain, nausea, dizziness, hyperventilation, muscle weakness. In extreme cases, full physical collapse. The body does not always wait for danger to become real before responding to it. Sometimes belief alone is enough. And that was exactly what happened the night Daniel fell to the kitchen floor. Not poison entering the bloodstream. Fear convincing the body it already had. Years later, Emily would sometimes replay one particular memory from the beginning of their relationship. Long before marriage. Long before suspicion. Long before hospital rooms and therapy offices. She remembered a rainy night during their 20s when her car broke down outside a grocery store. Daniel drove nearly 40 minutes through a storm to help her, arriving soaked, exhausted, laughing the entire time while changing a tire under flashing headlights. Back then, she trusted him completely. Back then, he trusted her too. That memory hurt the most because it reminded her that people rarely recognize the exact moment trust begins disappearing. It fades gradually beneath repeated fear, repeated silence, repeated emotional distance. And by the time either person notices how serious the damage has become, they are often already standing in the ruins of something they once believed would last forever. Even after the divorce finalized quietly the following year, Daniel continued struggling with shame connected to the incident. Not public shame. Most people outside close family never learn the full story. It was a private shame. The kind that follows someone internally during ordinary moments. Grocery stores, dinner invitations, sitting across from another human being while food rests untouched between them. Because no matter how much therapy helped him understand what happened intellectually, one truth remained impossible to escape emotionally. For one terrifying moment in his life, he genuinely believed the woman he loved was trying to kill him. And she knew it. The years that followed moved differently for both of them. Emily rebuilt her life quietly, the way many people do after surviving something emotionally exhausting. She changed jobs eventually, moved farther outside the city, and stopped explaining the divorce in detail whenever new people asked questions. It was easier to call it complicated than reopen memories that still felt difficult to organize neatly in her mind. Because even after everything, the story refused to fit into simple categories. There had been no affair. No violence, no hidden double life, just fear growing slowly inside a marriage until it became stronger than the connection holding that marriage together. Daniel remained in therapy much longer than anyone expected. At first, he focused entirely on understanding the panic attack and paranoia surrounding the dinner incident. But over time, sessions uncovered something deeper beneath it all, a lifelong pattern of internalizing fear instead of expressing it. He admitted that even as a child, he struggled with the need to feel certain about things before trusting them completely. Uncertainty unsettled him more than it seemed to affect other people. And when adulthood introduced pressures he could not control, financial instability, aging, professional failure, emotional distance, his mind searched desperately for something concrete to blame for the discomfort growing inside him. The food became symbolic long before he consciously realized it. Meals represent trust, safety, dependence. And once he unconsciously connected fear to those moments, every dinner became emotionally charged in ways Emily could never fully understand from the outside. One therapist later explained something important that stayed with Daniel long after treatment ended. He said paranoia does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it develops through repeated emotional reinforcement. A person notices one coincidence, then another. Anxiety links them together. Fear keeps the connection alive. Eventually, the brain begins treating suspicion like instinct instead of interpretation. And once that happens, convincing someone they are safe becomes extremely difficult because they no longer experience reassurance the same way other people do. Daniel cried during that session for the first time in months. Not because he finally understood Emily better, because he finally understood himself. And understanding himself meant confronting something devastating. The realization that the person who frightened him most that night had never actually been Emily. It had been his own mind. Meanwhile, Emily struggled with a different kind of aftermath. For a long time, she questioned whether she should have noticed the severity of his condition earlier, whether she dismissed warning signs because confronting them felt too frightening emotionally. Therapists reassured her repeatedly that she was not responsible for Daniel's psychological decline, but guilt rarely disappears simply because logic explains it away. She replayed conversations endlessly in her head, wondering whether different words might have changed something, whether insisting on therapy sooner could have prevented everything, whether one more moment of patience during those final weeks might have interrupted the path they were heading toward. But relationships damaged by prolonged fear often leave both people carrying different forms of grief. Daniel grieved the trust he destroyed. Emily grieved the version of him she slowly lost long before the collapse happened. Several years later, they encountered each other unexpectedly inside a grocery store on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The interaction lasted less than 5 minutes, but both later admitted privately that it affected them more than they expected. Daniel looked older, calmer too. The restless tension that once followed him everywhere seemed softer now. Emily smiled politely when she saw him standing near the produce section, though both immediately recognized the strange emotional weight surrounding such an ordinary place. They spoke carefully at first. Small conversation. Work. Family. Health. Safe subjects. But beneath the politeness existed the shared awareness of everything neither fully knew how to discuss anymore. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel apologized again. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just quietly. He said he was sorry she spent so long feeling unsafe inside her own marriage. Emily stared at him for several seconds before responding, and what she said stayed with him for the rest of his life. She told him the saddest part was never the accusation itself. It was watching fear convince someone she loved to stop recognizing her completely. Daniel lowered his eyes after that, because deep down, he knew she was right. Fear had changed the way he looked at her, the way he interpreted her actions, the way he experienced reality itself. And once fear reaches that level inside a relationship, love alone often cannot survive it. They said goodbye shortly afterward and walked away in opposite directions beneath bright grocery store lighting while ordinary shoppers passed around them unaware of the emotional history existing silently between those two people. That moment became the final chapter neither of them expected. Not dramatic reconciliation, not hatred, just two people finally understanding that what destroyed their marriage was never poison hidden in food. It was unspoken fear left untreated for too long. And maybe that is why this story unsettles people so deeply even years later. Because most viewers listening will never experience a dinner collapse or a hospital investigation. But many will recognize something else hidden underneath the story. The slow emotional distance. The conversations were avoided. The quiet suspicions were never addressed directly. The way fear can gradually reshape how people see each other if left alone long enough. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all is this. By the time most people realize trust is disappearing, they are usually already standing much closer to the end than the beginning.